Superficial scribblings on sexism. Superficial scribblings on life. Who the fuck needs criticism? And I can always be right. Hello, Southern guys and gals, and here with you is another delayed episode in Superficial Scribblings on Sexism. The Unexamined Brutality of the Male Libido by Stephen March of the New York Times. Fuck me, isn't that a mouthful of loaded problems with an article? With the New York Times staining their esteem with this sexist content against men, while trying to feminize men while manning up the women based on the actions of some powerful men, it reeks of the last article I covered trying to paint all men as bad because of Harvey Weinstein's actions alone. But sure, you scoff and say, well, it is an opinion piece, so it isn't indicative of New York Times views, but you got to see the bigger picture of all this. This is the prevailing thought of these male feminists, soy boys, cuckolds, whatever adjective or buzzword you want to apply to them, that in their display of outrage against some men that they feel they are doing a great service to the plight of women, as well as these big media outlets who say that. Like as if they are implying that women are incapable of making mistakes of their own, which is ultimately the crux of this Me Too movement propping up out of Hollywood. But before I burn this house down with Stephen in it, let's see what kind of foundation he's laid his argument with. After weeks of continuously unfolding abuse scandals, men have become, quite literally, unbelievable. What any given man might say about gender politics and how he treats women are separate and unrelated phenomena. Liberal or conservative, feminist or chauvinist, woke or benighted, young or old, found on Fox News or in the New Republic, a man's stated opinions have next to no relationship to behavior. Isn't that an ironic thing to say, coming from you, or at least the kinds of male feminists who like to remind you how they are for women, and that they are shown to be extremely abusive to women as a result? It's like a murderer who tells you constantly how they are against killing someone. If they were so against it, they wouldn't have to tell you constantly about it like they're trying to relinquish guilt of the thing they find irredeemable. Their actions would otherwise define where they stand on something. That's why Steve Shives buying an anti-Nazi pin was the most pathetic way to virtue signal that no one bought it when Steve runs his Twitter and YouTube channel like a fucking fascist Gestapo. But to the point at hand, Stephen is basically painting a broad brush at men because of the accusations of assault and not whether or not the claims are fucking true. And more to the point about Harvey Weinstein, while I'm certain that he's likely to be a sexual assaulter, the women are completely innocent in all of this. The testimonies they give to set up the eventuality is the tall tale of a woman knowingly getting themselves in a shady situation with the promise of getting a good job or propped up in Hollywood. And people are trying to say that they couldn't see how the situation could have gone poorly. This Me Too bullshit isn't mean to say women can't be accountable for their own actions with the simultaneous claims or evidence for the claim. So no, nothing of this is any enlightenment on what men are or think. It's a bunch of loony lefties who feel that in order to empower women, they have to patronize them to the point that they will directly take any action upon themselves to play the victim. Through sheer bulk, the string of revelations about men from Bill Cosby to Roger Ailes to Harvey Weinstein to Louis C.K. to Al Franken and, this week, to Charlie Rose and John Lasseter have forced men to confront what they hate to think about most, the nature of men in general. Again, based on nothing more than claims, but seeing that Harvey and Bill have been convicted of said crimes, yes, some men are fucking scumbags, but that doesn't mean that you should, with reckless abandon, paint all men as such. It's like that stupid bitch in that BuzzFeed video who seriously asked, how does it feel to be the same gender as Donald Trump? Like as if we hold some kind of hive mind that think the same, while they proceed to act like a hive mind. Also, Louis C.K. didn't actually harass anyone. He asked some women if he could show his wiener to them. Whether that's creepy or not isn't the point. He didn't do it indiscriminate of what they wanted. But that's just one of the many false equivalencies and generalities this fucking opinionator makes. This time, the accusations aren't against some freak geography teacher, some frat running amok in a southern college town. They're against men of all different varieties in different industries with different sensibilities, bound together solely by the grotesquerie of their sexuality. Well, if we're going to go a jaunt down generality lane, why don't we paint Elizabeth Bathory, Melissa McCarthy, Kathy Griffin, Angela Merkel, Aileen Wuornos as indicative of all women rather than just notably bad eggs? Oh, it isn't fair to generalize all women that way because they don't speak on behalf of all women? Then your argument that men are just naturally inclined to do this rather than humans' natural tendency to have sex is flawed and hypocritical. Men arrive at this moment of reckoning woefully unprepared. Most are shocked by the reality of women's lived experience. Almost all are uninterested or unwilling to grapple with the problem at the heart of all this, the often ugly and dangerous nature of the male libido. You know what I miss from bullshit articles, apart from the generalities? The weasel words. Most are shocked. Almost all. The often ugly and dangerous nature. All little bubbles of a plausible demographic or number, but not needing the inference to gauge just how many. Again, I know this is an opinion piece, not some hard-hitting fact-based truths, but if this guy can name the accused so easily, he should be able to give me an idea of what men think of women. Except he can't. He's only saying they think that way because he was told by other feminists that they think that way. Therefore, it must be true and doesn't have to investigate further. For most of history, we've taken for granted the implicit brutality of male sexuality. Starting out with another weasel word, boding confidence in me that this guy in no way will hedge the idea that male sexuality is pervasive to fit his perceived bias of them with the added implicit bit. Because you know what's implicit? A mass demographic of one gender being sexual deviants to women. Yeah, blow me. In 1976, the radical feminist and pornography opponent Andrea Dworkin said that the only sex between a man and a woman that could be undertaken without violence was sex with a flaccid penis. Well, she's a fucking bullshit artist, and is basically implying that women never can consent to sex, which how would she know that? As for how she knows that any sex is violent with an erect cock is a whole other thing, but yeah, there's your source for you. A second wave into the third wave feminist who already has a negative perception of men as your smoking gun for why men are so bad. Please, suck your confirmation bias cock to completion some more. I think that men will have to give up their precious erections, she wrote. Because fuck men wanting to enjoy some pleasure, right? Only women are deserving of sexual pleasure. In fact, let's take it even further. Let's actively cuckold ourselves so we don't feel as though we are intruding on a woman's right to fucking cheat on us while we're at it. In the 3rd century AD, it is widely believed the great Catholic theologian Origen, working on roughly the same principle, castrated himself. So you are literally arguing for men to castrate themselves, like with feminists, right? Because Harvey Weinstein took advantage of other women's opportunistic behavior? Yeah, that's a smooth transition of thoughts and beliefs, and not of someone who really just fucking hates men and needs any excuse to validate their preconceived notions. Fear of the male libido has been the subject of myth and of fairy tale from the beginning of literature. What else were the stories of Little Red Riding Hood or Bluebeard's Castle about? Just from a literature standpoint, you say? It couldn't be cucks like you possibly are. The feminists deeming anything a man does as toxic masculinity without weighing any positives in, treating men like women, or any of that. As for Little Red Riding Hood, I thought the idea of that story was not to trust strangers, but I guess that would apply to the women who thought that Harvey would give them a red carpet without putting some legwork in, so to speak. A vampire is an ancient and powerful man with an insatiable hunger for young flesh. Werewolves are men who regularly lose control of their bestial nature. Get the point? Yeah, that there are fictional characters that don't exist in real life, only in a metaphorical sense. As for women, sirens are sea maidens that lure sailors to their death. Witches are enchantresses that put curses upon others for their own amusement. Checkmate, Stephen. There is a line, obviously, between desire and realization, and some cross it and some don't. But a line is there for every man. So you're basically saying that women are not prone to that same line. there's no standard for them, whereas men do. Wow. You really are making your men just can't control themselves argument sort of fucking moot when said men face those consequences and do have to be respectful in some manner. And until we collectively confront this reality, the post-Weinstein public discussion, where men and women go from here, will begin from a place of silence and dishonesty. Silence and dishonesty coming from you and your ilk, where a claim is all you need to get your pitchforks and demand men need to lose their genitals, and that none of those women could have taken the precautions not to get in a shady situation with someone they don't know. It's not like the reason this even imploded in the first place was because of the degradation of the leftist ideology, where they have to take what a woman says like it's 100% the truth and gospel. The masculine libido and its accompanying forces and pathologies drive so much of culture and politics and the economy, while remaining more or less unexamined, both in intellectual circles and in private life. Again with the weasel words, but I can actually partially explain this unexamined economy and politics that men seem to work into. Competition is a driving force of almost all of it, and men, with their testosterone, are naturally prone to compete and take risks to do that. Them having that inherent drive does not make them privileged, nor does it necessarily give them a leg up against women. While the majority of men are top-level CEOs, the majority of men are also the criminals and the ones who are the most incarcerated in the prison systems because of one thing that a lot of these regressive types just don't seem to understand: the bell curve. More women are generally more average in terms of intelligence, whereas you have men generally more on the extreme positive and negative. So no, this isn't some kind of patriarchal system that only seeks to benefit men. It's ultimately a result of what a competitive market most desires. If you want to make an argument that markets shouldn't be competitive, make that, instead of tiptoeing around the problem and insisting that men just need to stop working wholesale because of institutions of systemic isms. I live in Toronto, a liberal city in a liberal country, with Justin Trudeau for Prime Minister, a half-female cabinet, and an explicitly feminist foreign policy. A Canuck and a cook all in one? This pretty well explains the nature of this article altogether, but I do find it funny that you mentioned Trudeau, since his means to diversify the cabinet was through arbitrary and discriminatory means, with the subtle notion that he personally thinks that women are capable of reaching that power without a man to help them in the process. And the cycle of patriarchy, as you presume, repeats unabated. The men I know don't actively discuss changing sexual norms. We gossip and surmise who is a criminal and who isn't. Which of the creeps whom we know are out there will fall this week. Beyond this gossip, there is a fog of the past that is better not to penetrate. Keep your weird innuendos to yourself, you weirdo. But yeah, I think those guys are considerably more reasonable than you because they don't automatically assume that those guys are guilty of a crime. You once again bring up the past in this hypothetical bubble that no one wants to touch when it's just your exaggerated screeching over what couldn't be changed. Aside from the sorts of clear criminal acts that have always been wrong, changing social norms in the imprison of memory are dark hallways to navigate. Be careful when you go down them. You might not like what you find. Yeah, don't seek truth through adversity. Just believe what you're told, because if you did look deeper in between those lines, you realize most of the claims are fallacious at best and nefarious at worst, comparably with the claims against Donald Trump that got dropped soon after. But no, you're trying to project this as us as a society not seeing the dark secrets that all men keep, yet you figured it out somehow. Weird. I never got my brochure from the Great Patriarchal Council about our plans to keep women down. Must not be a man then. So much easier to turn aside. Professionally too, I have seen just how profoundly men don't want to talk about their own gender nature. Maybe they don't like to talk about it because it doesn't dictate how they define themselves. Unlike you, who flog yourself in the mirror and remind how you could protect the woman at a moment's notice. But yeah, women don't prefer male CEOs over female CEOs. Nope, that doesn't happen. And white women didn't vote for Trump. And anyone who is a minority and not your shield was a fucking puppet too, right? In the spring, I published a male take on the fluctuations of gender and power in advanced economies. I was interviewed over 70 times by reporters from all over the world, but only 3 of them were men. Because when you want to get the male experience in how men run companies, Talk to women, because as we've established here, they know better than you fucking white cis straight male. I also would love to see if you did this, because I'm certain that most of their questions were similar since they are morbidly curious about the same things. Men just aren't interested. They don't know where to start. I'm working on a podcast on modern fatherhood, dealing with issues like pornography and sex after childbirth. You mean having children in the porno business as a woman? I imagine that would be a mite problematic, not to use an overused word too much, for the relationship with the father. Although if you're a cuck, I imagine you prefer to be the father in that relationship where 6 black guys are all gangbanging your porno wife. So I have no idea where your concern would be. Very often, when I interview men, it is the first time they have ever discussed intimate questions seriously with another man. What a load of bullshit in a can of worms. I highly doubt that any man hasn't had a real talk with another man about something, and it's just once again you projecting your own idea that men just talk about innocuous shit like how big their last poop was, or of hot women they saw nearby. A healthy sexual existence requires a continuing education, and men have the opposite. There is sex education for boys, but once you leave school, the traditional demands on masculinity return. Show no vulnerability, solve your own problems. Teach men not to rape? Is that your implication here? You do realize that those who do rape know it's wrong, but simply don't care? Why do you think that you don't see isolated rape incidents out in broad daylight within the public? And yeah, solving your own problems is a good lifestyle choice, because if you rely on someone else to save you from your own fallbacks, you just basically become those same women who made those accusations in the first place, posthumously after the events happened long ago. Why? I have to wonder, is it wrong for boys to be fucking boys? And not your version where you think that means I tolerate them raping people or whatever. I mean the principle of even being a male is a problem to you. Is it because you yourself lack those fundamentals and, I don't know, want to set the bar lower so you don't have to accommodate for your own fallbacks? Men deal with their nature alone and apart. Ignorance and misprision are the norms. Yep, they just hide it all away except when it's broadcasted on international news for the umpteenth time about how Trump said grab her by the pussy in a situation that was likely staged, given that Trump gets tackled by some random black man soon after. That's what men do, fellows, according to the beacon of what men think, Mr. Stephen March. Which is how we wind up where we are today, having a public conversation about male sexual misbehavior while barely touching on the nature of men and sex. Why is that? Because not all men are doing this and taking advantage of it? Nope! Couldn't be that! We're just too scared to talk about and deal with our toxic masculinity and male privilege. Stephen is a generality machine here. The very few prominent men who are speaking up now basically just insist that men need to be better feminists, as if the past few weeks have not amply demonstrated that the ideologies of men are irrelevant. Yeah, their ideology is irrelevant, but not for the reasons you think. You see, people have to remind you often about their moral coda, often won't have said moral coda. The reason they do this is basically a way to put the target off themselves when and if someone else does a heinous act, because deep down, they know they have done said heinous act, which means for those feminists who insist men should be, guess what? It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, because sooner or later, they will wind up doing horrible shit to women now that they have told everyone that they are feminists, and those feminists will have more evidence to prop up their existence as said ideology. Not that any of that could even cross Stephen's mind. He'll still unironically be a feminist, and when he's found to have sexually harassed women, this article will be even more doubly ironic, as he's basically sealed his fate. Liberalism has tended to confront gender problems from a technocratic point of view, improve systems, improve laws, better health, until cultural Marxism, intersectionality, and regressive leftists fucked all those otherwise agreeable notions and wanted forced diversity, define anything they dislike as hate speech, and making genders a spectrum in spite of lacking evidence. But enough about the degradation of the leftist ideology. That approach has resulted in plenty of triumphs, but there remains no cure for human desire. It isn't actually about sex, it's about power, I read in The Guardian the other day. How naive must you be not to understand that sex itself is about power every bit as much as it is about pleasure? Well, if this couldn't be any worse, the New York Times are now using The Guardian as a sort of their info. Fuck me. But on top of it, he adds the reframe from earlier about how women can't have consensual sex unless a man can't enjoy himself too. If sex was just about power, then why are there power bottoms? Why are the rapists only reasons for raping is for lust? And why isn't there more cases of rape by men in that case? Oh yeah, under careful scrutiny, this is all bullshit and basically a way to say that Stephen is otherwise powerless and feels as though sex is the only way he can have power, so envious of it to the point to try to denounce other people's sexual pleasures, because that's a liberal perspective, right? Acknowledging the brutality of male libido is not, of course, some kind of excuse. It's also not factual and doesn't paint said brutality of male libido off of you just because you acknowledge it. Male feminists harass and rape too! Sigmund Freud recognized the id and knew it as a chaos, a cauldron full of seething excitations. But the point of Freud was not that boys will be boys, rather the opposite. The idea of the Oedipus complex contained an implicit case for the requirements of strenuous repression. If you let boys be boys, they will murder their fathers and sleep with their mothers. Well, let's take this absolutely bullshit scenario to heart. I've been allowed to be a boy, and my father is still alive. In fact, I've been mostly estranged from both my biological mother and stepmother. Whether that facilitated my usually shy nature towards women isn't really the crux of this argument. Stephen is desperately trying to connect two things that have nothing to do with each other to come to his conclusion as to why Harvey Weinstein made women suck him off for a role and then ostensibly say all men do that in the same situation. Freud also understood that repression, any repression, is inherently fluid and complicated and requires humility and self-searching to navigate. Yeah, because when I consider the humility of repressing the male sex, I think of male tears, kill all men, and toxic masculinity. Isn't that fucking kind and generous to basically write off the male gender as a whole? There isn't two genders, 3 or 8 million, only one deserving of humanity in Stephen's eyes. Women are calling for their pain to be recognized. Many men are quite willing to offer this recognition. It means they don't have to talk about who they are, which means they don't have to think about what they are. Okay, Stephen, if that's fucking true, if a family was crying about the loss of a loved one by a murder, and you recognize that as being wrong, does that mean now you don't have to come to terms with the fact that you eventually, maybe, one day, perhaps, might murder too? How about this, Stephen? Recognizing something is bad doesn't mean you have to grovel on the floor for the appeasement of someone else, because those men very well may have never done anything wrong. Also, talk about what they are, the regressive cycle is complete. Stephen doesn't see men as individuals who may do good and bad things. They're this thing that needs to be repressed and corralled, or else they might act out. Much easier to retreat into ever more shocked and prurient silence, or into the sort of reflection that seems less intended as honesty and more aimed to please. Again, why do you think that a man feeling empathetic for a woman's plight means that he's somehow also guilty of it? Or that he has to acknowledge that men are shit by the actions of literally one man? Does the same also apply to a woman, Stephen? If a woman decides to tweet her excitement of aborting 8 babies, does that mean now women have to come to terms with what they are, you regressive piece of shit? Sex is an impediment to any idealism, which is why the post-Weinstein era will be an era of gender pessimism. Why am I not surprised that sex and intercourse are counter to feminist ideology to you? You already was for the idea that men need to have flaccid cock sex and castrate themselves too, so it doesn't really say any more about what you already believe. Also said, contractual sex that Weinstein may have aggressively offered is equally the same to said consensual sex that apparently never happens, or the contractual sex or of pornography too, according to Stephen, but keep doling out the word soup like with gender pessimism. What if there is no possible reconciliation between the bright, clean ideals of gender equality and the mechanisms of human desire? Imagine a world where feminism didn't exist and didn't need to prop its existence with inflamed non-problems like systemic issues. Yeah, I could imagine. As for your compromise between the two, why do you think it's an impossibility? Oh yeah, that's right, because You think natural human desire is a one-way street, and gender equality is a one-way street. Men only want to lust, and women are forever daunting at the idea of gender equality in Stephen's eyes, because if it weren't, he wouldn't have to polish his sword and shield bright for the next eventual attack on woman that he's watching always. Meanwhile, sexual morality, so long resisted by liberals, has returned with a vengeance, albeit under progressive terms. Progressive terms being, it should be okay to bully and harass a female porn star to suicide because she doesn't want to have sex with a gay guy for a contract. Yeah, that's a progressive idea of sexual morality. Give women the right to do what they want, except when it disagrees. The sensation of righteousness, which social media doles out in ever-diminishing dopamine hits, drives the discussion, but also limits it. It drives it, it limits it, it rises to the top, it falls to the bottom. It's up in the sky, hypotheticals and nonsense as far as Stephen is fucking concerned. Does self-righteousness fall into the equation? Because I imagine a lot of you regressive types feel thrilled to see another man falsely accused of rape. Because remember, a woman can never lie, like with George Washington. Unable to find justice, or even to imagine it, we are returning to shame as our primary social form of sexual control. Can't find justice, even when those accused are being thrown to the coals by mass media articles who virtue signal about how against harassment they are, and those women feeling ashamed by playing the victim over and over again. Yeah, Stephen, your Kool-Aid isn't biting. The crisis we are approaching is fundamental. How can healthy sexuality ever occur in conditions in which men and women are not equal? Name me one right that men have that women don't. I know you can't, except for your, well, men don't have to worry about being catcalled on the streets, which is a fucking privilege, so this question presumes that you believe that women don't have the same rights. Frankly, they have more. Out of no evidence, but do go on. How are we supposed to create an equal world when male mechanisms of desire are inherently brutal? Inherently brutal by whose standards? Yours? That second-wave feminist claim? Malarkey. And with a dollop of females can't be brutal in the bedsheets notion too. You're also once again conflating Weinstein's sexual desire, which if he really just wanted to fuck, I'm sure he could. It was a matter of taking advantage of a woman's desperation, with the sexual desire of all men, once again, which is just more deja vu from my last episode where they made that false equivalency stamped right on its forehead. We cannot answer these questions unless we face them. I read recently that we are living in a Tucker Max culture. Mr. Max, bro icon, was the author of the libidinal epics like I Hope They Serve Beer in Hell that sold millions of copies by celebrating cruelty and a total lack of concern for women's humanity. By what basis? By the title of the book? Do women not drink beer according to you? I'm not going to take any snipes at this Tucker Max fellow to heart unless I know more about him, so you can just get fucked with about that. But Mr. Max eventually realized that his casual, unthinking misogyny was destroying him and everyone he loved. Wait, so you mean to tell me that being a misogynist piece of shit actually has consequences and doesn't go unabated? Wow, that completely destroys his idea that men don't talk about their casual misogyny, that does it. Better yet, if what you say is true, Mr. Max actually had his own personal hell to pay from his own thoughts, so that also defeats your argument earlier about how men don't have to come to terms with who they are. So good job, Stephen. This article is completely devoid of purpose, other than your desire to please women in any pathetic way imaginable, which is ironic considering that you said earlier that it's a cheap novelty to doing anything productive. You got trapped in the spider's web you've spun. He undertook a substantial course of classic Freudian analysis in an attempt to become a decent man. I can only wish we were living in a Tucker Max culture. That is the culture we desperately need. Okay, now I see why I made that reference. I figured that the Tucker Max culture was negative connotation, but now it's a positive because Stephen wants all men, regardless of what they've done, to flog themselves at the mass and not Tucker Max's personal flogging for wrong things he might have done. I know this is a hard thing to believe, Stephen, but humans do bad shit sometimes. Don't applaud at that thought. I know you've been taught by your feminist scholars that women are deities and men are devils, but just take it in for a fucking moment, and maybe you'll realize that this broad brushstroking of men as being bad will bite you in the ass. I'm not asking for male consciousness raising groups. Let's start with a basic understanding that masculinity is a subject worth thinking about. It's worth thinking about only in a negative light. What it does positive? What positive things? It only wreaks havoc and destroys worlds, of course. That alone would be an immense step forward. If you want to be a civilized man, you have to consider what you are. Yeah, you fucking men, as a monolith, you have to come to terms with what we've decided to define you as. Because if you aren't, you still most likely are, because Harvey Weinstein is a man who did bad shit. That must mean all men are just prone to that too. Pretending to be something else, some fiction you would prefer to be, cannot help. It is not morality, but culture, accepting our monstrosity, reckoning with it, that can save us, if anything can. Well, if men are naturally this way, really can't help ourselves, can we? Aren't you the same ideological ilk that try to save black people from themselves on a constant basis? Why is it men specifically have to better themselves, but black people have a safety net to fall into at a moment's notice? Oh yeah, because it's more ideal to give as many excuses for a given demographic that will defend and treat the demographics we don't give a shit about the absolutely highest contempt. Because if it worked for Hitler to broadly stroke Jews as being a piece of shit, so should this. And that's it with this long-winded article. Just a repeat of the last episode with a man who ironically will try to tell us that virtue signaling against some men is wrong while doing so himself. And if Stephen March does eventually get accused of sexual harassment, I'll be sure to pin this article back on him, since he's perfectly fine with the idea of just generalizing all men based on the actions of some, no? You mentioned earlier about gender pessimism, and sure, it sounds like word soup, but I think it has some levity to it. But not the kind of levity you present. The gender pessimism of not only demonizing all men based on the actions of a few, but also denigrating women's personal accountability when in regards to any situation, to the point that you have to treat them like a fucking child, naively wandering this world to be saved by the likes of you, the kinds of people who kept perpetuating this us versus them mentality to give us this situation, to control us by characteristics that are irrelevant overall. And I say, fuck your drawing of the lines, fuck your cultural and gendered segregationist talk, and fuck your pessimism to both genders.